A lot of us going there to our classes, we're not just directors or actors, we were writers and trying to understand what our jobs were as writers. And essentially what she taught us is that it was the job of the writer to go through the process just as an actor would, just as a director would, that we were obliged to have really beat out and examined what these motivations were and what the obstacles were, and that only if we had done it would those words fit well in those actors' mouth and those scenes work. And that was an enormous gift to think that we had to be not just literary, but practical. That you couldn't bring the soup to the table on the second line of a scene and then have somebody eating steak, and leaving the check in the eighth line. You had to think about what the rhythms were and what the business was. You had to think about what the intentions were, and that most of all, what you had to think about were the psychological realities, which is to say, people want more than one thing, or they want things that are contradictory. That the word "and" is as important as the word "or." The demands that she made of you were demands of a very personal kind, and you had no choice but to reveal aspects of yourself. And Nina had us do an exercise, which she probably still does, and I suspect is part of her teaching. It had to do with props, but it had to do with partnering. And she had us bring in an object, and you described the object in a very omniscient, very utterly cold and distanced, objective way, and then you reminisce about it. And the purpose of the exercise, which I'm sure everyone knows who sees this, tape, is as you describe something objectively, you treat that object in a particular way. But as you reminisce, that connection changes and it allows for a transference to take place, and because your focus is there, you unconsciously reveal so much that is internal and emotional about, and so the object that was once cool becomes hot. I think my whole worldview about what a director is was formed, by one of her phrases saying that the actors move the camera doesn't move the actors. The notion that that performance in that movie is more important than I am, that the story that I'm telling is more important than I am, and that the director's job is to do everything he can to put those things forward and to present them and to humble himself before that story, and that everything is in the service of telling the story. And so the idea that working with an actor is about narrative as much as it's about a personal exploration of a character. The idea that the work that one does with a camera is not about calling attention to itself, but rather to some attempt to further that narrative, is a beginning, of a whole philosophy about narrative film and the tradition of American narrative film, and it's the tradition of which she was a part, working with George Stevens and Weiler and those directors who were the bulwark of this gift of what the greatest tradition of American film is. So I think she was a kind of, an apostle of that. And I think we were very influenced, those of us who came under her sway. I had directed in the theater, so I had at least, read Stanislavski or read Uta Hagen. I had some notion of what directing the actor meant. But it didn't really prepare me for what I was to encounter with Nina, because hers was an entire worldview that she had formed based on those who had taught her, those she had taught, and her own experience as an actor. And she sort of amalgamated that into a single philosophical approach, which was an approach not just to acting and not just to directing the actor, but to life. Because she had seen a lot in her life and seen a lot in the business, seen a lot in the world. And she intended for us to hear it. It was exciting, and it was intense, and it was new, and it was also full of dread and competition and a certain kind of really trial by fire and even tough love, rendering, approaching brutality at times. Everything that we heard, because there was so much of it, I don't think we were capable of assimilating all that she intended to teach us as she was teaching it to us. And in my particular case, I think it was years before the penny dropped. Things would happen to me 3 years later and 5 years later or 7 years later in which I would go, that's what she meant. Now I understand. You have to take that classroom experience and let it steep over time, and then only when it's combined with practical experience do you begin to understand its application. And that's why the way she taught was to try to partake of application, where she had us putting scenes up on their feet and tried to have us act for others so as to see what those practical realities were. That I remember, things like her saying, the farther north the motivation, the cooler, the farther south in Europe, the hotter, but that pertains also to the body, which is to say that the farther north in the head, you're going to have one thing, and the farther south you go toward the genitals, you're going to get another. And she was, full of these kinds of declarations, which sounded a little bit, aphoristic, but really, when you start to understand their applications into the broader sphere of what we do, I remember her saying, if you don't know what a scene is about, check what page it's on. Because the likelihood is, if it's on page 25, that the stakes are lower and there's something expository. And if it's on page 87, probably it's getting pretty damn intense and hot in terms of where to pitch a story, because as a director, inevitably you're shooting always out of sequence, and obviously it's your job to keep track of that particular arc. I remember calling her and saying, listen, I'm directing this actress, and she's not terribly well brought up and doesn't really have great manners and never really had the kind of refinement that one might get in a private school or some sort of social setting. And and as philosophical as Nina was, she was very much also about quick fixes, the understanding of how to do something on the stage, because you only had that limited time and what worked. And I remember her talking a lot about speed, that one thing about manners is people's ability to slow themselves down. And I remember she talked about wearing a certain kind of clothes, that when you wear a corset you can only sit a certain way. When you have a long skirt, you have to be aware of where it goes when you walk in a room. Things like that. They were very interesting physical, practical solutions to something that I remember talking about with her actually in that moment. Yeah, it was great.